If Melania Trump had been a housekeeper or a waitress, would she have been quietly deported instead of becoming First Lady? AOC forced America to ask the question no one wanted to answer. It wasn't on the schedule. No one saw it coming. But there she was, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, seated on the congressional panel in Washington, calmly flipping through a file of documents under the glaring studio lights. The hearing was supposed to focus on Department of Homeland Security spending. Nothing glamorous, nothing explosive, just routine oversight. That changed in seconds. AOC leaned into her microphone, her tone casual but steady. Before we continue, I'd like to ask the witness about a matter related to the fairness of our immigration enforcement. She glanced up, pausing just long enough for the room to take notice. The chairman shifted in his seat. Two representatives on the other end of the table exchanged quick looks. AOC continued holding up a photocopy of a federal form. This document, which I obtained through public records, raises serious questions about whether First Lady Melania Trump worked in the United States under a valid visa during her early modeling career. A long pause. The witness, a DHS official named Charles Beckner, blinked. I'm not sure that's within the scope of, she cut in politely. I understand, but the American people have been told repeatedly that this administration values law and order, that no one is above immigration law. So if there's an instance where the system was bent for someone with power or proximity to it, I believe that's worth discussing, even briefly. The hearing room fell uncomfortably quiet. Beckner shifted, cameras zoomed in. Somewhere off to the left, someone cleared their throat nervously. But AOC wasn't letting go. She lifted another page. This is a signed contract dated 1996 showing Mrs. Trump, then Melania Knaus, had been paid for modeling gigs while on a B-1 tourist visa. That's a violation. The law requires a work visa, such as the H-1B, and yet her adjustment of status years later was smooth, with no record of penalties or investigation. Beckner coughed and reached for his water. I can't comment on specific cases. You don't have to, she said. The documents speak for themselves. There were gasps, then silence, then frantic tapping of keys as journalists in the gallery started writing. Phones buzzed under the desks of aides and lawmakers. Representative Carl Jensen, a Republican from Arizona, leaned into his mic. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move that we stay on topic. This is clearly a partisan ambush. AOC didn't flinch. It's not about partisanship. It's about whether some people get to quietly break the rules while others sit in detention for a visa lapse. She turned slightly in her seat and looked directly into the camera lens. Not at her colleagues, not at the chairman, not at the witness. At the viewers. At millions of Americans watching from living rooms, phones, and laptops. Her voice dropped, calm and precise. If the First Lady received special treatment, the American people deserve to know, because thousands of immigrant families have been torn apart for less. That line hit hard. On Twitter, the clip was already up. Someone had ripped the C-SPAN feed and edited a 10-second version. It was captioned, AOC just put Melania on the hot seat. Wow. Within 20 minutes, it had over 100,000 views. An hour later, it was trending nationally. In barbershops in Newark, on iPads in high school classrooms in Phoenix, on lunch breaks in Tulsa, people were watching it on loop. They weren't talking about DHS budgets anymore. They were talking about Melania, and not about her shoes, or her accent, or what she wore to some state dinner, but about something real, something raw. At a Starbucks in Modesto, two college students stared at the video, wide-eyed. Did she just say Melania broke immigration law? Yeah, and nobody did anything about it. In a senior center in Fort Worth, a retired librarian named Helen watched it with her book club and shook her head. They deported my neighbor's son for missing one deadline, but if this is true, the shock wasn't just in what AOC said. It was how she said it. Calm, measured, prepared. No finger pointing, no yelling. just receipts, and questions no one wanted to answer. But while the hearing room sat frozen, President Trump was across the country at a manufacturing event in Grand Rapids, completely unaware his wife's past had just become the biggest story in the nation. By the time President Trump stepped off the stage in Grand Rapids, the media frenzy was already in full swing. He had just wrapped up a speech to factory workers about American steel and trade policy, the usual script. A round of applause, a few handshakes, then the familiar waddle off stage with a stiff wave. The smile hadn't even faded from his face when a staffer leaned in, whispering urgently into his ear. Trump stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowed. "She said what?" he asked, voice low but sharp. Another aide held out a phone, a paused clip of AOC mid-question on the hearing floor. "Play it." He watched in silence. The second time through, his jaw tensed. By the third replay, his face was red. "She's lying. This is a setup, total disgrace," Trump barked loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. He slapped the note cards from his hand, papers fluttering to the floor. Cameras weren't supposed to be rolling, but one local news team still had theirs live. The hot mic caught every word. The clip hit the internet less than 30 minutes later. "Trump loses it over AOC's live bombshell," read the headline plastered across the top of the video. It went viral faster than AOC's original moment. Inside the West Wing, staffers scrambled. Phones rang non-stop. Communications Director Reuben Shaw barked orders across the hall. "Get ahead of this. I want counter statements from DHS, from USCIS, from anyone credible. Get something out now." Melania, in her private East Wing office, sat watching the original hearing clip with her longtime aide, Lydia. She didn't say a word for almost a full minute. "Do they have the paperwork?" Lydia asked cautiously. Melania's voice was quiet but tight. "They always had it." "Should we be worried?" "I don't know," she said flatly. "But Donald will be." At the same time, AOC was in her office back on Capitol Hill, cross-legged on a sofa, scrolling through the explosion of reactions. Her phone buzzed every 2 seconds with mentions, calls, and texts from journalists. She ignored most of them. She didn't need commentary. The footage spoke louder than any press release. Her legislative assistant, June Lynn, peeked in through the door. "You just broke the internet." Alexandria smirked but didn't look up. "It's not about clicks, it's about the truth." "Still," June added, "they're already calling it the visa bomb." Across America, the video was being dissected frame by frame. Late-night hosts were rewriting their monologues. Cable news anchors clashed live on air. On WJXN in Jackson, Mississippi, a local radio host took a call from an older woman who said her daughter was denied residency after working one weekend on a student visa. It broke her, but the First Lady gets a pass? In Portland, Maine, a high school civics class watched the clip and debated it. One student asked, "If they bend the rules for her, what's the point of the law?" At a food truck park in Tempe, 2 military veterans sipping lemonades in the heat shared a phone screen. "I didn't vote for AOC," one said, "but she's got guts. Gotta respect that." Meanwhile, Trump returned to the hotel conference room where Fox News had a live feed prepped and ready. He demanded a spot on Hannity that night. "I want to respond. We're not letting this go unanswered." But back at the White House, Press Secretary Linda Novak urged caution. "Sir, the more we react, the more oxygen we give it." Trump shot her a look. "You think I'm going to let that little socialist run her mouth and drag Melania's name through the mud? No, I want fire." The segment aired just after 9 p.m. Trump appeared live, face still visibly tight with anger. He called AOC's remarks a disgusting personal attack and a desperate stunt to distract from the border crisis. He didn't address the documents, didn't deny them either, just hammered the same message. This is a hoax. My wife followed the law. Except this time, people weren't buying it so easily. An immigration attorney named Celine Prado in Bakersfield posted a short video that same night. I've seen dozens of clients deported for less than what was described today. This isn't a hoax. It's a loophole the powerful walk through while everyone else gets punished. Her video hit 1 million views overnight. But while Trump raged on TV, AOC was already planning her next move. And it wasn't a soundbite. It was proof. By sunrise, AOC was already back in her office. No cameras, no press, just her and a small team reviewing every scrap of immigration paperwork they'd gathered. Some of it came from old federal filings, some from archived interviews, some from the Freedom of Information Act requests quietly submitted months earlier after a vague tip had landed in her inbox. She hadn't acted on it immediately. At first, she figured it wasn't worth touching. A rumor about Melania modeling in LA while on the wrong visa. No one wanted to be seen attacking the First Lady's past just to score political points. But after reading through the documents herself, she'd made a decision. If the rules are real, they have to apply to everyone. A tweet went up at 7:42 a.m. Good morning. For transparency, here is a timeline of documented inconsistencies in Melania Trump's visa history. Redacted copies of the relevant immigration forms are attached. #equaljustice. 4 screenshots, 1 PDF, no commentary, no name calling, no dramatic music or bold fonts, just the facts. The tweet blew up instantly. Newsrooms pounced. Lawyers zoomed in on the forms. Journalists confirmed the dates. According to the documents, Melania had participated in at least 5 paid modeling jobs in the U.S. between September and November 1996, all while listed as a tourist, a visa category that explicitly prohibited employment. On MSNBC, the headline read, AOC shares docs suggesting visa fraud by a First Lady in 1996. Over on The View, co-host Tiffany Carver said, look, it's not about going after Melania. It's about whether the laws are real or just pretend for the rich. Meanwhile, Fox News scrambled to get ahead of the story. Hosts pivoted to border enforcement, sanctuary cities, anything but the visa documents themselves. But the clips wouldn't go away. In a segment on CBS, former immigration official Grant Dillard said bluntly, if these documents are accurate, and they appear to be, then yes, this would have constituted a visa violation under federal law. And yes, thousands of people have been penalized for less. By noon, even right-leaning independents were talking about it differently. What started as a political grenade was now being seen as something deeper, a mirror on the entire system. At a diner in St. Paul, a waitress named Robin poured coffee for 2 construction workers arguing over the situation. One shrugged. It was 20 years ago. The other shook his head. Yeah, but my cousin got deported for working at a gas station on a student visa last year. Law's the law, right? At a middle school in El Paso, a teacher paused her social studies lesson and played the clip. Her students watched as AOC calmly explained the forms to the press. Afterward, a boy in the front row raised his hand. So if you're famous, you don't get in trouble? That was the question echoing across the country. Back in D.C., AOC's team was methodical. No gloating, no insults. She refused to go on TV just yet. When asked by CNN for a live interview, she declined. I said what I needed to say. The documents are public. Let the people decide. Behind the scenes, though, pressure was building. An emergency meeting was called in the East Wing. Melania sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, flanked by her legal advisor and her longtime aide, Lydia. They're asking for a statement, Lydia said gently. Melania didn't look up. What do I say? That I forgot which visa I had? That I didn't understand English? The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. We could say you were misinformed by your agent. It wouldn't be unusual. But it was illegal, wasn't it? The lawyer hesitated. Technically, yes. That was the first time she heard it out loud. Meanwhile, Trump stormed down the West Wing hallway demanding to speak directly with the DHS secretary. Staff scrambled to locate him. "I want an investigation into her visa," he shouted, pointing to a paused still of AOC on TV. Reuben Shaw tried calming him. "Sir, that would look retaliatory." "I don't care how it looks. She's not going to run this place." But the truth was, for once, he wasn't in control of the story. He was chasing it. And while Trump fumed behind closed doors, a slow shift was happening in the public. Not just outrage, but doubt. If the First Lady bent the rules and faced no consequences, what did that say about the system everyone else had to follow? The Oval Office was unusually quiet. It was just after 8 p.m. and the West Wing was nearly empty. Most of the staff had gone home or were avoiding the building altogether. Inside, President Trump sat at his desk, elbows planted firmly, both index fingers pressed together beneath his nose. He wasn't watching cable news for once. The TV was off. But his phone sat face up on the desk, lighting up every few seconds with alerts he refused to check. Across from him sat Jared Devlin, his newly promoted chief of staff, and Reuben Shaw, still clinging to his role as communications director despite calls for his resignation. "She caught us flat-footed," Jared admitted, trying to sound confident. "But we can get out in front of it." Trump said nothing. Reuben tried a different approach. "We leak something. Anything. Get the base stirred up. Paint her as anti-family, anti-immigrant even. Just twist the story." Trump's eyes snapped up. "Twist? Are you stupid? You can't twist documents. She posted the damn things." He stood up, pacing. She didn't even raise her voice. That's the worst part. No yelling, no drama. Just sat there and accused my wife of a crime like it was a Tuesday errand. Reuben tried to stay calm. "Then maybe we put Melania out there. Let her speak for herself. People like her." Trump waved him off. "She's not speaking to anyone right now." And she wasn't. Down the hall in the East Wing, Melania had closed her office to visitors. No assistants, no press calls, no hair and makeup, no prepared statements. Just silence. She sat by the window, staring into the dusk over the rose garden, her thoughts buried beneath layers of old interviews and half-forgotten memories. Her modeling days in LA had felt like another life. Contracts, agents, calls that came in late at night from shady photographers with foreign accents. At the time, she hadn't understood all the rules, and honestly, she hadn't asked. But now those blurred years were back in sharp focus. Lydia finally knocked. Melania didn't answer. She knocked again. "Melania, you should see this." The First Lady opened the door slowly. Lydia held up a tablet. On the screen was a new clip, this time from a rally in Orlando. AOC wasn't even there, but a supporter held up a sign. If she had been named Maria, she'd be gone by now. Melania stared at it, then said quietly, "They're not wrong." Meanwhile, back in the West Wing, internal tensions were boiling over. Ivanka had flown in from Manhattan, cutting her trip short to meet with her father. She was furious. "We told you to stay ahead of this," she snapped. "Why didn't you scrub this years ago?" Trump turned to her. "Don't start." "You made her a target," Ivanka shot back. "And now it's out there forever. People don't forget this stuff. The optics are terrible." "I'm the victim here," he shouted. "They're coming after my family." Jared Devlin glanced at Reuben. Neither of them moved. A knock came at the door. It was Secret Service with a sealed envelope. Another leak. This time from inside the USCIS archives. A short memo from 2001 indicating Melania's green card process had been expedited at the request of an external office. The name was redacted, but the date coincided with Trump's high-profile media blitz during the Miss Universe years. Rubin turned pale. That memo's going to be everywhere by morning. Trump grabbed the envelope, read it twice, then threw it down. You want to know what this is? This is sabotage. Someone inside is trying to wreck me. But no one had the nerve to tell him what he already suspected. It wasn't sabotage. It was history finally catching up. That same night, deep in the West End of Cleveland, two sisters sat watching the news. One of them, Elena, was undocumented. She had just been denied a green card last year after a minor clerical error. The other, Marta, was a naturalized citizen. Tell me how this is fair, Elena said, pointing at the screen. I did everything right. She worked illegally and became First Lady. Marta didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. But while the White House scrambled to clean up the damage outside those gates, the conversation was changing, fast. This wasn't about Melania anymore. It was about what the rules meant and who they actually applied to. By Friday morning, the mood across the country had shifted. What started as a political moment had become something else entirely, a cultural checkpoint. On talk radio in Albuquerque, in union halls in Akron, on city buses in Fresno, people weren't just debating AOC or Trump anymore. They were talking about fairness, about how the law seems to tighten around some necks and barely touch others. The hashtags were everywhere. Same laws, same consequences, visa privilege, patched not just Melania. In Columbus, Georgia, a former ICE field agent named Raul Meza recorded a video from his garage. He wore a stained ball cap and spoke directly into the lens. I've seen families ripped apart for a single missed signature. I've seen mothers deported for taking a part-time job without telling their sponsor. This ain't about hating the First Lady. It's about asking why we treat the powerful like ghosts in the system while everyone else bleeds under the rules. The video hit 2 million views in 24 hours. In Fresno, a retired school principal named Noreen Glick wrote a blistering op-ed in her local paper. She recalled a student, a quiet 7th grade girl named Maeli, who had disappeared one spring break and never came back. Her parents were deported after a workplace raid. She was 13, Noreen wrote, and we all pretended the law had done its job. Now I ask, would it have done the same if her name was Melania Canals? Cable news caught wind of that column and ran it on rotation. CNN invited Noreen to speak live. She declined. Let the story stay about the people it affected, she told them. Meanwhile, AOC remained strikingly calm. No victory laps, no press junkets. She issued only one more statement that week. This isn't about vengeance. This is about vision. If immigration law is real, it should be real for everyone, not just those who can't afford lawyers or PR firms. Her words were clipped and posted again and again. Even moderate-leaning voters began to nod along. There was no shouting, no stage drama, just a congresswoman asking why the same system punishes some and excuses others. At a small community meeting in Shreveport, Louisiana, 24 immigrants gathered at the back of a Catholic church basement to share their stories. They talked about wait lists, denials, and deportations. For the first time in years, someone in Congress was speaking in a way that didn't feel like lip service. I don't even like politics, one man said, but she's not playing a game. She just said what we've all been thinking. Not everyone was pleased. At a campaign stop in Fort Myers, Florida, Trump doubled down on his defense. Melania followed the law. This whole attack is disgusting. It's beneath the dignity of Congress. The crowd clapped, but something was different. The roar wasn't quite as loud. A few people in the back kept checking their phones. Conservative talk shows started shifting their tone too. Some pundits claimed the documents were misinterpreted. Others argued that the immigration system was too complex to judge from a distance. But even they struggled to drown out the clear evidence. The forms were real. The dates didn't lie. Back in Washington, reporters began chasing down leads on other high-profile immigration favors from the past 2 decades. Was Melania the only one, or just the only one whose name got caught in the spotlight? A producer at 60 Minutes began preparing a segment. A podcast team in Philadelphia started a 3-part series titled The Visa Divide. NPR lined up a panel of immigration attorneys, civil rights historians, and former White House staffers to talk about the broader implications. And in Los Angeles, a mural began going up, not of AOC or Melania, but of an unnamed woman holding her child, with a passport in one hand and a denied stamp across her chest. Spray painted above it were the words, "Rules for some, loopholes for others." By Sunday night, polls showed a sudden spike in AOC's approval among suburban independents. Not because she took down the First Lady, but because she said something millions had quietly believed for years. The system was never fair, and most people knew it. But while the public began taking sides, the White House was about to unleash its full machine. The next move wasn't just damage control, it was war. By Monday morning, the tone had changed, not just from the White House, but from every outlet even remotely aligned with it. It started with a segment on Morning Ledger, a cable show known more for theatrics than journalism. The host, Bart Wesson, sat on a high stool, sleeves rolled, eyes locked on the camera. "We've let a far-left congresswoman run wild with accusations. No evidence of a crime, just assumptions and gotchas. So maybe it's time we ask, what's really in AOC's past?" He didn't have to say more. Within minutes, fringe blogs and low-budget YouTube channels had taken the cue. A wave of headlines followed. AOC's father's tax records raised questions. Unanswered questions from Ocasio-Cortez's college years. Who's really funding her office? None of it stuck. Not because AOC was perfect, but because the attacks felt rushed, sloppy, desperate. And because the focus was still on Melania and the paperwork. By noon, the smear operation went deeper. A former congressional intern, someone who once served briefly in a summer rotation 3 years earlier, gave an anonymous interview on a podcast known for conspiracy theories. "She's cold behind the scenes," the voice said, disguised and robotic. "Very rehearsed. Not who she pretends to be on camera." That same day, an old photo resurfaced from AOC's college days. Her standing in a crowd, drink in hand, laughing with friends. The caption read, "This is who wants to rewrite immigration law." The backlash came swift, but not in the way they'd hoped. Thousands of women, especially young Latinas, posted their own party photos in solidarity. A new trend exploded on social media. #CollegePhotos for AOC. It was sarcastic, loud, and impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, her support had actually grown. Trump, furious, called a meeting in the Roosevelt Room. "Why isn't this working?" he shouted. "We've got the dirt. Why is she still winning?" Jared Devlin, now fully regretting the promotion, treaded carefully. "Because the public's not reacting to the dirt, sir. They're reacting to the documents." Trump banged the table. "Then find new documents. Make her play defense." But that wasn't going to be easy. AOC didn't have skeletons. She had stumbles, sure, bold statements, some too blunt. But she owned them. What she didn't have was the kind of hypocrisy that made headlines stick. That night, Fox News ran a piece trying to frame her as anti-immigrant for attacking Melania. But the anchor stumbled halfway through. because even he couldn't connect those dots. It's more about the process, I guess," he muttered, caught mid-broadcast. In Brooklyn, a teacher named Bryant told his civics class, "You know it's bad when even cable news can't spin it straight." Meanwhile, AOC was holding firm. She hadn't tweeted all day, no interviews, just silence, letting the chaos speak for itself. Her staff fielded offers from every major news outlet. The New York Times wanted an exclusive sit-down. Vanity Fair asked for a cover shoot. She declined both. "This isn't about me," she told June, her aide. "They'll try to make it about me because that's safer than talking about what the documents say." June nodded. "So what's next?" AOC leaned back in her chair. "They'll keep digging. I don't care. What matters is if we can keep the country focused long enough to ask the real question." "What question?" She answered without hesitation. Why was Melania protected when so many others weren't? That night, her silence broke. Not on Twitter, but in a town hall live-streamed from a community center in Milwaukee. She stood behind a worn podium, no frills, no staging. "This isn't about political points," she told the crowd. "This is about a double standard that's been sitting in plain sight for too long. My family came here legally, like many of yours. But I watched people I love jump through hoops, face threats, get denied, while others, with power or proximity to it, walked a smoother path. I'm not saying Melania Trump is evil. I'm saying the system is." The crowd stood, applauded. Some people cried. But as AOC's message hit deeper, far beyond politics or headlines, the real threat to the White House was no longer scandal, it was momentum. The first tip came through a burner email. No name, no phone number, just a short message and an attachment. Subject line, "You missed something." AOC's office had already set up a secure inbox for leads, but most were noise. Old gossip, fake forms, people looking for attention. This one was different. Attached was a scanned internal memo from 1998, unsigned but time-stamped, addressed to a former INS regional director in Los Angeles. The wording was vague, but it referenced a foreign national of Eastern European origin working outside approved visa parameters. The note ended with a curious phrase, "Matter deferred upon external instruction." June read it 3 times. This can't be a coincidence." AOC leaned forward. "It's not proof, but it's a pattern." 2 hours later, the whistleblower sent a second email. This one included a voice recording, distorted, filtered, untraceable, but the voice was steady, clear, and deliberate. "I was part of the intake team back then. We flagged the name when it came through, but it got kicked upstairs. Word came down fast. Drop it. Special instruction. No follow-up allowed. We didn't even finish the file." It wasn't a smoking gun, but it lit a fire. Within 24 hours, a second anonymous source came forward. This time, a woman, an immigration attorney who had briefly represented an international modeling agency in the late 90s. She didn't mention Melania by name, but referenced high-profile Eastern European talent that received quiet legal shielding. She didn't speak to the press, but she allowed AOC's office to quote her under condition of anonymity. And then came the third, the biggest, a former White House staffer, not from the Trump administration, but from the Bush era. He contacted AOC's chief of staff directly, using a real name and a public statement. "There's a precedent," he said. "We made immigration calls on behalf of connected people before, not often. But it happened, and it always came from the top." His words made it into the congressional record the next day. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Melania. It wasn't even just about Trump. It was about a pattern, a long-standing one. That same week, A former Trump campaign aide, Nina Kaplan, went on record. She had been part of the early 2016 PR cleanup around Melania's past, helping shape the narrative before major interviews and campaign ads. Of course, we knew the visa story wouldn't hold up, Nina said, during a taped interview with local DC radio. But the thinking was, no one would dare come after the wife. But someone had, and the country was still listening. In San Jose, a group of college students launched a searchable database of visa denial stories. People who had faced deportation or been denied entry for minor infractions. Within 48 hours, the site was flooded. Over 5,000 stories poured in. Names, dates, paperwork. People began comparing their cases to what Melania had done. One user wrote, "My sister was denied a student visa because she had modeling photos on Instagram. They said she might work without authorization, so she never got to come. And yet the First Lady?" At this point, even people who had tuned out the story at first were paying attention. In Wichita, a Korean War veteran named Walter called into a local AM station and said, "I don't care if it's 20 years ago. Either we have rules or we don't. If my granddaughter gets punished for something this lady was allowed to do, then we're not a nation of laws. We're a nation of favors." Inside the White House, the tone shifted again, from fury to fear. Melania stopped taking press briefings. Her public appearances were canceled one by one. She didn't attend a veterans luncheon. She skipped a fundraiser in New Orleans. Her absence became its own story. And while Trump still lashed out on Twitter, calling the leaks treasonous and sick, people weren't retweeting him like they used to. The engagement numbers were dropping. Even the base was distracted. Reuben Shaw knew it. He leaned over to Jared Devlin during a strategy call and whispered, "This isn't a PR nightmare anymore. It's a credibility crisis." Jared nodded slowly. "And she's not letting go." But the deeper the leaks went, the closer they came to something no one had expected. Someone inside the Trump circle ready to talk on the record. And they weren't just a staffer, they were family. Melania hadn't spoken to Donald in 3 days, not beyond clipped phrases in passing, and even those were rare. She'd moved back into the East Wing's private residence away from the family quarters, claiming she needed time alone. Aides were told to reroute all non-essential contact, even from the president himself. On Wednesday afternoon, while the West Wing scrambled to suppress leaks, she sat in a quiet corner of her suite with headphones on, listening to an old interview she'd given in 2005. It was a puff piece, glossy, upbeat, filled with surface-level chatter about fashion and childhood dreams. But then came the moment that stopped her breath short. The interviewer, off camera, had asked about her early days in America. Her own voice, lighter, less guarded back then, played in her ear. "I didn't have work papers at first, no, but I was creative. I made it work." She froze the audio. Melania didn't remember saying it, but there it was, plain as day. She took off the headphones and stared out the window, watching clouds roll in over the south lawn. Her heart thumped, not with guilt exactly, more with the sense that something had cracked, and there was no way to glue it shut. She had always been careful, quiet, deliberate. She hadn't asked for this role. She hadn't chased power, but she'd accepted it. And now she was being dragged through a scandal that, truthfully, she had spent years pretending never existed. Down the hall, Ivanka entered without knocking. "Mom said you were holed up in here." Melania didn't turn around. "I need space." Ivanka sighed, stepping closer. "You've got a choice to make. You either ride this out with him or you protect your own name." "I already made that choice," Melania said, voice low. "Years ago." Ivanka hesitated, then carefully, "The family's falling apart over this. Jared's being pulled into meetings with the RNC. They want someone to walk this back. They're hinting it should be you." Melania turned, locking eyes with her. "So they want me to lie? They want you to help." "I did help. I kept quiet. I stayed out of it. I smiled when they asked me to. I protected his ego. And now I'm the problem?" Ivanka had no response. She left the room without saying goodbye. Later that night, a camera caught something unplanned. Trump was leaving a donor dinner at a hotel in Indianapolis. Cameras flashed, and as he stepped toward the black SUV, a reporter shouted a question from the sidewalk. "Mr. President, is it true Melania's considering speaking to Congress?" He froze, briefly. It was only a second, but enough for anyone watching closely to catch the shift in his face. He didn't answer. Back in D.C., the rumors were everywhere. Congressional insiders were buzzing about a closed-door request made by a legal liaison from Melania's former modeling agency. Supposedly, she wanted to clarify her visa timeline. Off the record and under oath, no one confirmed it, but no one denied it either. The following morning, AOC's office received a handwritten letter. No return address, no email, just a note on thick stationery. "I cannot undo the past, but I never meant to cheat the system. I simply followed instructions. If anyone's to blame, it isn't me. M." AOC read it once, then again. She didn't smile, she didn't frown. She folded it carefully and placed it in her drawer without comment. "Was it real?" June asked. "Does it matter?" AOC replied. "She knows what she did, and now so does everyone else." That same day, the Washington Post released a special weekend feature, "Privilege and Paperwork: Inside the Silent Loopholes of America's Immigration System." It didn't name Melania directly, but the parallels were obvious. The cover image showed two women. One was dressed for a photo shoot, makeup perfect, walking out of a luxury car. The other was handcuffed in an airport holding cell. The article closed with one question: if the roles were reversed, would the law have followed them both the same way? But even as the media focused on Melania's silence, someone else was preparing to break theirs, and their testimony would threaten not just the administration's credibility, but its very foundation. By the time the House Ethics Committee convened, the air in Washington felt heavier, like everyone was holding their breath and waiting to see which domino would fall next. It wasn't technically a trial, no subpoenas, no criminal charges, just a formal review into the systemic favoritism in immigration enforcement, triggered by mounting pressure from within both parties and the public. But everyone knew what it really was: a spotlight. And AOC was ready for it. The hearing room was full, standing room only. Staffers, reporters, law students, and even a few diplomats packed themselves into the corners. C-SPAN's live stream hit record viewership before she even took her seat. AOC walked in wearing a dark navy blazer, hair pinned up. No dramatic entrance, no notes in hand, just quiet focus. She sat down, placed her hands neatly in front of her, and waited. The committee chair, Congressman Fred Lang, cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, we appreciate your presence today. This is not an investigation into any individual. It's a review of whether systemic gaps in enforcement allowed certain individuals to bypass immigration law based on social or political status." AOC nodded. "Understood." Lang continued, "We are aware your statements triggered this process. Would you care to begin with a summary of your concerns?" She didn't hesitate. "Over the past 2 weeks, Oditi," she said, voice steady, "the public has seen what many of us already knew, that immigration enforcement in the United States isn't just about policy. It's about power. The enforcement isn't equal. And when that inequality becomes routine, we stop being a nation of laws and start becoming a nation of access. Some in the room scribbled notes. Others just stared. She went on, "I did not come here to humiliate anyone. Not the First Lady, not her husband, but I believe with every part of me that if she had been a housekeeper from Guatemala working without the right papers, her story would have ended very differently." A murmur went through the crowd. Across town, Trump was watching the live stream from the White House residence, pacing with a Diet Coke in hand. Melania was nowhere in sight. "She's grandstanding," he muttered to himself, just trying to stay relevant. But his inner circle wasn't so confident. In the hearing, AOC began listing names, not of individuals, but of cases, quiet cases, real ones. Names like Bahar from Istanbul, denied a visa after overstaying by 12 days. Eduardo, deported after working part-time at a pizza shop while awaiting status. She read each story calmly, tying them back to the system's silence on Melania's past. Congressman Lang interrupted. "Are you saying the First Lady received preferential treatment?" "I'm saying the records show violations that were never investigated, while thousands of others were." Across the room, one member of the committee, Congresswoman Elena Frey, chimed in. "She's not wrong," Frey said, flipping through a binder. "And it's not just Melania. There are at least 14 documented cases where celebrity, wealth, or political ties influenced immigration outcomes." Another representative, a moderate Republican from Kansas, leaned into his mic. "Then the question isn't about who broke the rules. It's who the rules were designed to forgive." The hearing took a turn. What began as a focused review became a broader indictment of selective enforcement. Law professors testified. Immigration attorneys shared stories of clients facing punishment for infractions far smaller than what had been alleged against Melania. Then came the moment no one expected. A retired federal immigration officer, Walter Gelman, walked into the room, unannounced. He'd sent a written request to testify just that morning, and the committee made a last-minute decision to allow him 3 minutes. Gelman adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. "I signed off on Melania Knaus's adjustment of status in 2001, he said plainly, "and I remember very clearly we were told not to dig too deep. Not because of fraud, not because of error, but because someone powerful asked us not to." Gasps rippled through the room. AOC didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just sat still, eyes locked on the man, watching the truth do what it always does, eventually show up, even if late. By the end of the hearing, headlines were writing themselves. Preferential immigration system confirmed. Retired officer admits pressure in Melania green card case. AOC's statement sparks bipartisan ethics inquiry into favoritism. Even conservative outlets struggled to spin it. A few tried claiming it was all procedural. Others fell silent. But no one could ignore what was said. Not anymore. And now, the question wasn't whether AOC had gone too far. It was whether she'd gone far enough. The following week, President Trump hosted a closed-door meeting with top GOP donors at a luxury resort just outside Sedona, Arizona. The media wasn't invited, but someone leaked the agenda: unify the message, limit AOC's reach, and shift the story. But it was too late. No matter what he said behind velvet curtains and guarded gates, the public conversation had moved on, and the message stuck. In Topeka, Kansas, a high school senior named Brianna used her graduation speech to talk about her parents' immigration story. Her father had been deported years earlier for filing paperwork late after a change in employer. "We followed the rules," she said into the mic, "but the rules didn't follow us." The crowd didn't cheer. They stood in silence. Then one person clapped. Then another. Then the entire gym rose to their feet. A few days later, in a strip mall in San Bernardino, a man walked into an immigration law office with a folded newspaper in hand. It was the Washington Post article. He pointed at it and asked the woman behind the desk, "Do you think they'll ever fix it now?" Even she didn't know how to answer. In Washington, AOC returned to her normal duties. She hadn't addressed the scandal publicly since the ethics hearing, but the impact of her words lingered far beyond the Capitol. Requests for interviews poured in. She turned nearly all of them down. When pressed about it by a local reporter in Baltimore, she simply said, "I've said what I needed to say. Now it's up to everyone else to decide what they want this country to be." That line was printed on posters, stenciled on the sides of coffee trucks, scribbled in notebooks across college campuses. Her approval ratings among independents and young voters surged. She was suddenly the face of a movement that wasn't about left or right, but about fairness. Not just for immigrants, but for anyone who'd ever felt the rules changed depending on your last name or your zip code. Even critics had to admit she'd done something rare. She told the truth, didn't overreach, and let the evidence do the work. Inside the White House, Trump grew quieter. The anger hadn't gone, but the shouting had dulled into long hours in the residence, staring at cable news that no longer worked like it used to. His tweets got shorter, his schedule thinner. He still defended Melania when asked, though by now reporters had stopped pressing. Her silence had stretched too long, her absence too noticeable. She released no statement, no denial, no appearance, just silence. Some said she was protecting herself. Others whispered about separation. None of it was confirmed, and none of it mattered anymore. The public had made up its mind. The real win wasn't political. It wasn't legislative. It was cultural. A new awareness had taken root, a quiet reckoning over what fairness really meant. And in Queens, back in the district AOC still called home, a woman named Letitia stood on her brownstone porch and watched her youngest son walk to the bus stop. He turned back waving. "I'm going to be a lawyer," he called out. "Like the lady on TV." Letitia smiled. "Just remember what she said," she replied. "Follow the rules, but don't be afraid to ask who made them." That night, AOC posted a single tweet. "Laws matter, but justice matters more. One is written, the other is chosen. Choose wisely." The post went viral again, but she didn't check her mentions. She was at a small table in a community center in Newark, listening to local residents talk about green card delays and work permit renewals. No cameras, no staffers posting clips, just conversation. At one point, an older man leaned over and asked, "You really think it made a difference?" She looked at him and said, "It already has." Because sometimes the biggest shift doesn't come from outrage. It comes from exposure, the quiet kind that forces everyone to look at what's always been there and finally admit it doesn't add up. And in that space, between truth and consequence, something starts to change. If you believe in fairness and equal treatment under the law, share this video. Subscribe for more stories that matter, stories that remind us how real change begins.